Well, welcome everybody. Are there so many acronyms and abbreviations that you can't keep up? Do not worry, I have got you covered. I have created a one-page abbreviation and acronyms. So I guess I've been working in education and special education for so long, I sometimes forget I use words like PDA and I don't mean public display of affection. I was recently running a workshop for families and carers, and it reminded me for families with a new diagnosis how overwhelming it can be with all these acronyms we use, like OT, assuming people know that means occupational therapist. Or imagine if you're new, English is your second language, or new to Australia, you might know all the abbreviations we use. So it's really important you share this one-page PDF that I'm sending out to you. Please share it with your community. As always, about saving you time. And if families don't know what you're talking about, that can be overwhelming. It can be stressful. They might go home and be Googling or not sure. So sharing knowledge and information as always builds a strong relationship, I believe. So you might even want to print this up and put it in your staff room or in the early childhood, put it on your notice board. This is a great way to assure that people understand. Now, I have added to that PDF, that first page, a little bit about neuroaffirming practice because there's a lot of misunderstanding. So the way I look at it, my birth name is Susan. Now, some diagnostic terms are a bit like your birth name. They're not necessarily what you like. So, for example, autism spectrum disorder is what the World Health Organization uses. But many people don't like the word disorder at the end. They would prefer condition. But it is the official term, just like my birth name is Susan on my passport. So I believe neuroaffirming practice is respecting what people want to label they want to use, whether it's neurodivergent, neurodiversity. Some people prefer the word Asperger's. I don't know if you can hear that, but a siren just went off, and I do feel it is a little bit like that. When I put a post on Facebook or on Instagram, I get a lot of people telling me it should be child with autism or it should be autistic child. Actually, some universities want it one way or the other. There isn't a set way. Just like my name is Susan and I prefer Sue, but some people call me Suze or Susie. I don't really mind about the Sue or Susie, but I do get offended by the Susan. So some people don't mind the word autism spectrum disorder. Some people do. Some people like child with autism. Some people like autistic child. I personally prefer the word neurodiversity because it encompasses the complexity. Many of the children I work with have more than one diagnosis. I like what Tony Atwood says, without a diagnosis, children are judged. With a diagnosis, they can be supported. Now, neuroaffirming for me is about embracing that diversity, the neurodiversity. And that's why I start all my podcasts with embrace difference to make a difference. We also need to embrace whatever terms people want. I can show you 100 Facebook pages that are advocating for the term Asperger's rather than autism. That's a personal preference, and I respect that. I meet families who have some very old diagnosis. For example, we used to use a thing called PDD-NOS, and I meet families who have children in their 30s who still have that pervasive developmental disability, not of specific. Now, families aren't going to spend $2,000-$3,000 to get a new diagnosis. It's all about understanding the individual and working with whatever the family prefer, or once the child can advocate for themselves, what term they prefer. So I have included a page on neuroaffirming practice, which I think is helpful too, to just give a little bit of context to that. And I think that could be helpful to put up with the acronyms and abbreviations for people who may be a little bit confused about what terms to use and when. And really, the confusion is that it's a personal preference. So, hope you have... Oh, by the way, so often people go, Sue, I didn't get the email. Please, I know I say it every 10th episode, whitelist me, make sure that I'm getting past your spam folder. I know I send a lot of emails. It's only because I'm trying to save you time and energy. And if you've signed up, I want to make sure you get those emails. I have so many good things coming out this term. We are going to be covering everything from a whole new thing I'm exploring, and I'm still writing this podcast. I've talked for years about the difference between meltdowns and tantrums. And I've talked about different types of meltdowns, like children getting angry or anxious or depressive meltdowns. Well, I am adding in there social meltdowns. So do not miss that episode on social meltdowns. I'm doing a lot of research into social meltdowns, how it can look, what you can do. So keep an ear out, an eye out for that one. And do subscribe to my podcast. Someone asked me the other day, do I have to pay? No, it's free. Just get it subscribed. So when you go to your downloads, my podcast episodes are there. You don't have to listen to everyone, but sometimes it's easy to forget about a podcast. And if I use the Apple Podcast app, it actually tells me which episodes I've listened to and how much. So I find that really helpful because you're probably like me. Sometimes I'm driving and it just moves from one podcast to another because I have them in a queue and I forget which ones I've listened to. So I highly recommend just subscribe, costs you nothing, and you don't have to listen to every episode, but at least then they're in your downloads ready when you get a moment at the gym or on the walk or so forth. So I also think when we look at all these terms like PDA, which by the way, if you're wondering doesn't it stand for public display of affection? Well, it can, but it also stands for pathological demand avoidance. If you understand all these terms, fantastic. But there is a lot of confusions around what autism level 1, 2, 3 means. What is the difference between ODD, ADHD, PDA? And I thought, who better than Emily Hanlon to share that with us. Now, this actually is an older episode, and you might have listened to it before. Emily came on the podcast way back at episode 113. And would you believe we are coming up for podcast 300? So all of my OG, my older listeners and group, thank you for being with me through all these episodes. Can you believe it? 300 episodes. And I haven't done a replay of this one of Emily. So I thought this is timely with our abbreviations and acronyms. People who are probably trying to understand that might also want to understand the differences between these diagnoses. So who better than a psychologist to share that with us? I mean, I am a teacher, so I don't diagnose children. I recognize their different way of thinking and learning. But when I get a report, sometimes I'm a little bit confused too because it's written in a language I don't always understand, and different psychologists I find often write things differently and I have to read between the lines. But dare I say, teachers can be a little bit like our reports for families. So I'm going to get we're going to do a replay of Emily's fantastic episode. I also wanted to let you know that there are 4 ways to learn this term. You can join me face to face. I'm going to a whole lot of different places. I'm going to Brisbane, Mackay, Albury-Wodonga, Sydney, Tamworth. So check on my website. I might be coming to somewhere near you. I've got a live virtual again at the end of June. I do that at the end of term because I know how busy your terms are. So the 27th of June, which is the last day for Queensland before you go on holidays. So it could be an opportunity to do a learning from home. Book it in now so you can have a learning from home day. What I love about those live virtual days, the feedback is amazing, like unbelievable. You can watch me from anywhere in the world. We have people from New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Fiji. But what I love about those days is there is an energy. And I mean, people stay on all day. It impresses me. It's, 5 hours of learning. So if you're like, I promise you, my live virtual Zoom days are not like other Zoom days. I don't use the Zoom platform. I use another interface over the top. People love it. Schools email me after and go, how did you do that? We need we need what you use, which is great and always a compliment. And I'm always happy to share how we've set it up. But I do encourage you to sign up to the 27th of June. If you're in Australia, I'll send you out a show bag with treats for the day and highlighters and pens and a whole lot of fun things. sorry, can't send that outside Australia because we're sending food and often sensory tools that are wooden. And anyway, they all got stuck in customs last time we tried to do that. So I've learnt my lesson, but you'll get everything to download. You will not miss out on anything that you need that's vital. So face-to-face, live virtual, or if you prefer to learn online on demand, I mean, we've got a school of 100 staff. Actually, it's more than that, like 140 staff doing my online on demand session across 4 or 5 1-hour sessions and in their groups, in their learning levels, which is just fantastic. What a great way to do it. So if you're interested in that, let us know. Obviously, you can do it individually, but if you want to do it as a team or group, we have group discounts. If you're planning your professional learning for this term, I was just talking to a principal this morning who was like, okay, how can we keep upskilling our staff? We're getting more and more neurodiverse children. We're not really sure how to accommodate them. And staff don't have a lot of time for training, and they've already done my course. So what's next? Personally, I think what's next is the PDA course or the executive functioning course. They are 2-hour deep dive mini trainings to really lift your skills and understanding of neurodiverse children. Or as I said to the principal, if you're getting a lot of children sent to the office, then I'd do the emotional regulation course, get your staff to do that, because never in the history of calming down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down or actually being sent to the office. We want to give the child the skills to recognize their emotions and then regulate their emotions. And actually, some of my children would prefer to be out of the classroom. That's where they regulate. So are they learning the skills to actually, I hate the word cope, but, to regulate in a classroom? So the emotional regulation course would be great. And if you're planning your whole school PL or professional development, depending what state you're in, dare I say it, already taking bookings for 2026. So please have a think about the ways that you want to learn this term or moving forward as a whole school. Don't forget to download the PDF with your acronyms and abbreviations, your what is neuroaffirming language, and that has the 4 ways to learn. I know I speak really fast, so we'll have some good reminders and let you know if I'm coming near you. Hope to see you soon. Do not forget to come up and get a photo with me. I don't like to ask. It's a bit awkward, but if you ask me, it makes my day. I promise you that is one thing I show and share with my family whenever I come home from workshops. I'm like, oh, I met a podcast listener. It was so cool. And dare I say, it does motivate me when I meet you in person, because sometimes I feel like I'm just sitting in the room talking to myself. So I hope you get a lot out of this podcast with Emily. I hope the acronyms help you. Oh, I should have said the acronyms could have gone for 2 or 3 pages. I just put in the ones I hear the most. So happy listening. Have a great term 2. I am sure that you and your children are going to have an amazing term. And remember, do something different. If it wasn't working last term, this is your opportunity to do something different this term. I am absolutely thrilled to have Emily Hanlon on the podcast today to help us all understand autism, common confusions and misunderstandings. Emily is a psychologist and the daughter of the wonderful Randa, who I interviewed in podcast episode 107 about what you can do to increase inclusion for Autism Awareness Month. Emily's brother has autism, and she did her clinical masters on wellbeing of siblings of children with ASD compared to children with typically developing siblings, which we hope to do a podcast on in the future. And I will link to the research in the podcast notes. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So excited for you to share. I mean, I know I meet teachers and parents and even people on the spectrum who really don't understand what all these labels and words mean. So I'm hoping that you as a psychologist can help us sort of unpack and understand when a teacher gets a report, what a lot of these things mean. So
Absolutely,
can you give my listeners some labels, diagnostic terms that they might hear and explain what they mean?
Sure. So when a child gets a diagnosis of autism, they're given a level of functioning. So there's 3 levels, which in my opinion probably isn't enough to cover like the broad spectrum of individuals that do present with autism, but it's what we've got. So it's what we've got to go with. And just as a side note, I know a lot of families aren't thrilled on that labeling system as well. But again, it's what we've got. So it's just something I guess that we have to work with. So you get a level from 1 to 3. Level 1 is more your high functioning autism. So I guess people with a level 1 diagnosis would probably have have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Then you've got level 2, which is moderately functioning. So they can still do quite a lot of things. My brother is classified as level 2. So he can, for example, catch public transport by himself, and he's verbal and all of that, but he does really struggle, and he's in supported employment roles and that sort of thing. Whereas level 3 is what we classify as severe. Often, but not always, people with a level 3 diagnosis are nonverbal. They have severe difficulties with communication, self-care, and behaviour.
Yeah, and I liked that you've said that actually level 3, because I hate the words high, low functioning severe. I'm sure you do too, because
Absolutely.
when I get to know the child or the person, that label doesn't really fit with what I know about them.
Yeah, for sure.
And I always say, look, I think that's a starting point, but you need to get to know. And I know when I was at uni, we did that old self-fulfilling prophecy where if you think a child is low functioning, well, that's where you're going to pitch things.
Absolutely.
And I've worked with kids who have limited communication who are super bright. So
absolutely. It's a really challenging, as a psychologist, I find it really difficult because that's the terms that, we're trained to use. But as a sibling, I know that that's not always the case. And I know that in some areas, my brother's level 1, in some he's level 3, and in some he's level 2. It doesn't fit everything, it doesn't fit his presentation properly.
Exactly. And I think that's what I struggle with as an educator, because sometimes as a teacher, I'll have a student who's like amazing in one area and we could call them high functioning, and in another area, probably low functioning. Or one area impacts on all the other areas, like communication. So how do you evaluate a child if they have limited communication? It's very hard in a testing with a psychologist to actually know where that child's at. So I like to call it their functional label. So how do they function in a busy classroom, or how do they function in employment? Like how does that functionality look at home or school and impact on their learning and therefore provide support? But the problem is when we get these levels, that often leads to the support. And I meet teachers all the time who struggle with that. So I think we're on the same page. And I guess
definitely.
For everyone listening, we all struggle with these terms, but it's good to have an idea when you get that report when it says level 1, 2, 3, what it means. So thank you for that.
No worries.
The other thing I get a lot of inquiries about, and more kids getting this ODD and PDA diagnosis. Can you give us a little bit of insight in that?
Sure. So ODD, so oppositional defiance disorder, is a diagnosis in which a child is characterized by like defiant and really disobedient behavior, primarily towards authority figures. So not so much their peers, more so people in authority. The cause is actually unknown, but it likely involves a lot of genetic and environmental factors rather than like a biological core issue. And I think the biggest factor when it comes to ODD is that it is environmental. So a lot of the work is actually done with parents. Like, yes, individual therapy will focus on the child, but a lot of the work is done to modify the environment to make sure that child can thrive. So I guess in that regard, it differs from autism because it's purely behavioral, whereas, kids with autism have difficulties in other areas like speech, sensory difficulties, food fussiness, communication, and so on. So if you simplify it and break it down, ODD is more so behavioral, whereas autism is a lot more than that.
Yeah. And what about this PDA then?
So PDA is not necessarily like a diagnosis of its own. It's so pathological demand avoidance. It's more like a behavioral profile that describes people whose main characteristic it is to avoid everyday demands and expectations to a really extreme extent. So obviously a lot of kids are going to be a little bit defiant in some areas, but this is like quite extreme. And so how PDA differs from autism is that it's a behavioral profile. It's not an additional diagnosis. So a child can be diagnosed with autism with a PDA profile, but would not be diagnosed with PDA as such.
Right. So this is what's so confusing, right?
Yeah, it is.
So confusing.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I've taught students, PDA I've only started hearing about in the last couple of years, but when I worked at the autism school, we had a lot of students with a dual diagnosis of ASD and ODD. And without a doubt, the ODD had the biggest impact on learning.
Absolutely.
So the ASD was important, but the ODD just impacted everything. And you really had to come from everything from the ODD and work very closely with the families. In fact, still good friends with most of those families, because when you're working with an ODD child as a teacher, we have to be on the same page and be consistent and also really honest. I just found if parents text me going, he's had a really bad morning, I knew what to get out that morning to support.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's so important. Like that communication between schools and families is so important. And I think sometimes it can get a little bit like us versus them.
Yeah.
And it just shouldn't be that way because, I do that even with my 10-month-old son. I tell the daycare, I'm like, oh, he didn't sleep well tonight. Good luck. It's just all about that open communication.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said the good luck, because one of my mums, who I still am a good friend with, she's so funny. She'd text me and go, turning off my phone, good luck today,
So true. That's my type of mum.
Yeah. And that humour is so important, and honesty and that honest humour, I just found. Yeah. And actually that little ODD boy had a really good sense of humour. And I found that one of the most important things. He often didn't deliver it with the humour. He'd deliver it in a tone of voice that you could misinterpret. But once I got to know him, I knew there was a lot of humour in his things that he would say to me. So, it's
so funny.
Not easy. And I think in a busy classroom, it is really hard because those kids, I find often, if, as you say, they're often good with their peers, but as soon as you put a demand on them, they start reacting. And that's where I found building a good relationship with their peers was actually a really important strategy.
Absolutely. So important.
And my little boy, he had a roster of who sat with him, and we called it his appointment book. And so he didn't burn out his peers, and he'd rotate who he was with. And I had times in the day where he was the teacher and he got to be like helping children with their work. And then were other times that children helped him, and times when they're at a similar level. But I found that worked really well, where he got to be the authoritarian figure sometimes and got to be awesome. He was really good at reading. So he was like he collected the readers every day and marked off who'd read, and then he would run the reading groups, and that just built his self-esteem. And
absolutely.
Yeah, but I had to rotate who he was with, because he just strategies would wear out really fast with him. And that's what I think can be so tiring for parents and professionals, that things only work for a little while with our ODD and PDA kids because of their anxiety. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as well that comes down to like a lot of the time those inclusion strategies that, to no fault of their own, teachers are trying to implement because that's what they know or that's what they've been told, often accidentally become like exclusion strategies, and that child actually becomes excluded when the whole aim of that strategy was to try and, filter them back into the classroom or get them involved. And it's quite funny how quickly that can happen. And it's a really tricky balance, I guess.
Yeah, and I have some students who don't want to go out with a teacher assistant. We know that they need a little bit of one-on-one support, and that can be really hard for my teacher assistants, because they perceive their job is to take that child out and work with them, but that child doesn't want to go, particularly as they head into secondary, and if they've got a little bit of ODD or PDA, well, you can't have a little bit, but if they are, that behaviour and the hormones in teenage, and sometimes we have to accept that they don't want to be excluded, and they're seeing it as exclusion.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get back to our terms. Sorry. I knew this was going to be hard to stay on track, Emily. Sorry, everybody. Emily's a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so excited to sort of chat to her about these things. So it's wonderful to have a psychologist to bounce ideas off. Now, what about ADHD and ASD? What's the difference there?
So this one I think is probably the trickiest to decipher, because a lot of kids present with both diagnoses, and a lot of the time, yes, a child can have both diagnoses, but I think a lot of the time they're given both and it's not overly necessary. And I know that can be controversial, but I think a lot of the time kids are diagnosed as autistic and with ADHD, and it's probably more the autistic behaviors that can and symptoms that are covering both diagnoses. But to that being said, you definitely do have kids that present with both. So like I said, they can look really, really similar. They can both have problems focusing, be impulsive, have difficulties with communication. But I guess when you're trying to look at what's what, it's all about what's causing the behavior. So if you look at the example of turn taking, that's a good one. So kids with ADHD may not be able to stick to turn taking, but they understand what turn taking is. Whereas kids with autism don't necessarily have the understanding of what it means to turn take and need to actually be taught at a basic level what that is. And again, like a kid with ADHD might not respond to their name when it's being called. That doesn't mean they don't know what their name is. That's just a bit of inattention. Whereas a child with autism may not recognize their name initially and understand what that means. So the behavior is exactly the same, but you really don't know what you're looking at until you delve down into what the cause of that behavior is.
Oh my goodness, Emily. I wish I had heard that 30 years ago. You have just summed up in 2 minutes what I have experienced for years but wasn't able to explain as well as you.
It's tricky, right?
That is so good. I love that. I absolutely love, because it's so true. Like in my early years book, I explain why you have to teach turn taking to a child with autism, because often early educators will go to me, well, why do I need to teach? It's like, because they have no idea.
They fly straight over their head. You might as well try and teach a 5-year-old algebra.
Because they are so happy playing on their own. Why would they want to share it? Like, and they like control and routine, and someone else coming in is not going to work on that.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
I'm not going to start with their favorite toy to teach turn taking because we're better off starting something that actually never played with if we want to teach turn taking. Whereas you're right, the inattention, which is like when I'm doing group work in a classroom, that some of my children with autism are just best with a partner, because the more kids, the harder the social and the waiting, right? But a child with ADHD, the reason I might do a partner is because they just can't wait for their turn.
Exactly. And I think that's the trickiest thing, like, because the behaviors are exactly the same in a lot of aspects. And if you don't understand this and delve down to the core of it, it's really tricky to to decipher what's what. And that's to know what no one is at fault for that, because I actually explained this to someone yesterday. I studied at uni for about 7 years in total across all the degrees. And in that 7 years in a psychology degree, I did 1 hour on autism, and that was an elective for a child development subject. So if me, a clinical psychologist, has only studied autism for 1 hour, how can we expect, every teacher to have a proper understanding when it's not part of their, big curriculum and that sort of thing? So it's no one's fault. It's just like we just need to get that information out there.
Wow, Emily. Yeah. Because, that's the same for educators, for teachers. So
absolutely.
Teachers can do elective of special ed, but they're not just doing autism. They're doing
exactly.
ADHD, autism, cerebral palsy, muscular, like every disability.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to me too. I learned what it is, not what to do. So
exactly.
But I didn't realise in 7 years you did 1 hour.
1 hour. And it was an elective child subject. So it's ridiculous. Wow. And I always say everything I know about autism, I've gone out and learnt myself, or I've lived through my own family and that sort of thing. So and that's what I say to families as well when it comes to choosing a therapist. Don't just assume that your therapist knows about autism. You need to find someone that goes and puts their hand up and says, no, I've gone out and I've done more work to help your family.
Yeah. And this is, look, I'm sure for families and teachers listening too, that so often we notice a child is different and need to go send for a diagnosis, but then for parents to go to the right person. And dare I say, going back to the ADHD, I've sent kids off for diagnosis that I know are autism and they come back with ADHD.
I know.
And that is really hard because it costs the parents a lot of money. And why would they go back for another diagnosis when a professional just told them? So as a teacher, should I be trying to direct parents to people that I know have an expertise in ASD, or because we often don't want to say the word? So how do I approach that? How do I approach it?
So I would always say a lot, like, look, 80% of the time I would say that parents have an inkling that something's going on. And For that 20% of the time, obviously that conversation can be really, really difficult to have. So always obviously be mindful that one of two things can happen. It could be the first time that they're hearing this and it may come as a real shock and they may be in denial, or they may say, we're waiting for this conversation to happen. And I think a lot of the time it's not until kids, especially girls, are quite good at masking. So I think sometimes it's not till kids get to that formal education setting that the real difficulties and the difference between them and their typically developing peers may, start to arise. But I'm always a firm believer, though, of letting parents know what the child is doing well, no matter how small. So even if you're like, this child is like, I'm going home every night crying about how to help this child, please also tell the parents a list of positives as well. I will never forget, I went to this one parent-teacher interview with a family who asked me to go, and they sat there for about half an hour. We said nothing, just telling us all the things that this kid's not doing right, how he's failing, how he's behind his peers. And I said, oh, sorry, we've spoken a lot about how, poorly he's doing. Can you just tell us what he's doing right? He's got to be doing something right. And they all looked at each other and they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, no, tell us. And they didn't have it.
Stop.
Yeah, it was honestly horrible. And I honestly was so thankful that I was there, because the mum was in tears. It was horrible. So no matter any interaction that you have, I would always say, please. And, as being a sibling as well, I've been to all my brother's parent teachers and stuff and I only remember the words of one where they told us how amazing he was. And that's what resonated with me. And that's what made us want to work with the school. If you're always telling parents what's wrong, they don't, they're always going to come to those meetings.
No good relationship comes from negatives.
Absolutely.
The psychologists say it's 4 positives to 1 negative.
For sure.
And I am always mindful of that, and sort of making a bit teary because I'm remembering about a beautiful little boy I had at the autism school called Ricky, who I adored, absolutely loved. But he was an identical twin, and his twin was actually twice exceptional, gifted and talented. And Ricky had limited communication, hand flapper and toe walker and classic autism, you call it, right? And his mum came in for the parent-teacher interview. So it's just in prep or reception, kindy, whichever state you're listening. And so he's 5 years of age. And I said to his mum, Carol, I love Ricky. He is so cute. I love the way he flaps his hands and his feet. And she just started crying. She said, Sue, no one in my family has ever loved my son.
Oh, my God.
All I hear is, why is he different to his brother?
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
It's horrible.
And I still get teary because every time I think of that story, I'm back in that classroom because I was just doing who I am, which is seeing the positives and the glass half full, right? And for her, it was the first time in her life, and we had the most fantastic relationship. I actually became really good friends with her because
awesome.
I was a person in her life who actually saw the positives, and it just builds. And, for teachers listening, just taking that moment to point out the smallest thing. Yeah. So many of my families are so used to being defensive.
For sure. For sure.
It takes a while for them to hear the positives. So,
yeah, absolutely. And that's what I always say. If a family's coming to you and comes off really defensive, don't take it personally. Just remember that this is probably the 500th meeting that they've gone to, and they're assuming they're about to be attacked. It's like literally a defense mechanism.
Absolutely. And it's the biggest complaint with NDIS too, because it's all a deficit. It's all the things your child can't do.
Yeah.
And that is, I'm all about begin with the end in mind. What are we building towards?
Absolutely.
Where are we going with this? What are the things we can do to give this child long-term skills and outcomes, and like your brother, end up in supported employment and live his best life? All of us
for sure,
need to live our best life. So I understand parents' frustration with NDIS. It's all about the deficit. And I know we have to fund based on that, but there should be part of that that's about, hey, here are all the positives too.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not wrong.
Exhausting. Anyway, we've gone off track. But this was about common misconceptions, and that is a big common misconception.
Yeah, it is. It is for sure.
And teachers listening probably have reports coming up in the next 3 or 4 months, and I'd love them to make sure, even in that parent comment, the teacher comment, to make sure it is full of all the good things that have happened, because for me that is so important. Okay, so I know one of the biggest challenges we have is the kids who slip under the radar, the kids who we can't get diagnosed. So can we just have a little touch on that? Because I know I meet teachers every week who are like, I don't know what to do, Sue. They haven't got a diagnosis. What do I do?
So if a child hasn't got a diagnosis, I think that the number one thing is really, really obviously trying to push for the family to go get external support, to get a second opinion, especially with girls, because a lot of girls go off for a diagnosis and come back with the diagnosis of like anxiety.
Yeah.
Which is frustrating. So I would also like say if your school has like a school counselor or a school psychologist, definitely get some supports from them. And also I think the biggest thing is, and I know it can be time consuming for teachers who have, 20 to 30 kids in the classroom, sometimes even more, but sometimes just taking some time to fill out like a bit of a data sheet and collecting data can really open your eyes to exactly what's going on. So again, a lot of the times you might think that a child is just throwing pens across the room to be really, really naughty. But once we take a step back and we gather some data, we can see that that was actually maybe their attempt to interact with another peer, but the peer was ignoring them, so they threw more pencils. And it wasn't until all the pencils were on the floor that everyone turned around and gave him attention. So it's all about, I'm a big believer with, you do not have to agree with behavior at all. You can hate the behavior, but you absolutely 100% of the time always need to empathize with the emotion that is underlying that behavior, because that behavior is happening for a reason, and you cannot expect to change that behavior if you don't know why.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that pencils is a classic example.
Yeah.
And many of my kids who slip under the radar, it is because they're sort of half getting it right like their peers. So other peers throw a pencil to get attention and then they don't get caught. But this kid takes things a step too far and throws all the pencils. I always say the kids I work with just get caught. Other kids are swearing. Other kids are breaking rules. They just know how not to get caught. They look for the teacher.
And they know when to stop.
They know when to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you. Absolutely. Whereas my kid doesn't know that. And so they shouldn't get in trouble for not knowing. We need to think, what can we put in place? Because behaviour serves a purpose no matter what. And we don't always know what it is, but we have to come from there. So I love that. Thank you, Elle. Thank you for that. Who else slips under the radar? What other kids?
So I think children whose IQ is not in the category of intellectual disability. So I think children with autism, especially that level 2 and level 3, obviously they still require a lot of support from our school system. And unfortunately, our mainstream school system really tends to follow that like one size fits all approach. And if you think of a child as a puzzle piece, like you can make it fit if you really want, but it's never going to quite fit that system. So I think a lot of people, if you've never raised a family member, or if you've never had a child go through our current education system, you think like, well, these kids need a lot of support. Maybe they should be in a specialized school setting. And you know what? For some children with autism, that's probably right. And absolutely they'll benefit and they'll thrive in a specialized school setting. But a lot of special schools require a child to also have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability in order for them to even be considered for their limited enrollment spot. So that, just to break that down, that means their IQ needs to be below 70. But most children with autism actually have an IQ well above 70. Most are average, if not high average and superior. So that's the really, really big problem. They don't belong in that specialized school setting, but the mainstream school setting is ill-equipped to foster their learning. So for these kids in particular, there's this common misconception that they're not thriving and they're not social and they don't know what to do, but that just couldn't be further from the truth. They're desperate for supports and they're desperate to make friends. And, like we were just saying with the pens throwing, same thing in the playground. My brother, I remember at school, was so desperate to make friends that he'd just run up and grab the basketball and run away with the ball at lunchtime. And the school, again, misunderstood that as him just being silly and him wanting to irritate his peers. But if he had a little bit more support, it would have been really clear that he was just trying to fit in.
Totally. And I see this all the time where people misunderstand, and it's the fact he's grabbing the basketball tells me a lot about him wanting connection with his peers. And I agree. And I do feel for schools because
for sure.
I'm one of those teachers and I can see the potential, but I just don't have time. And
absolutely.
one of my students many years ago, bless him, he was super smart, but he was also a social justice minister. So he says, everything he had, and he was very mathematical, so everything was math. So he said to me one day, Sulaki, I come to school for 6 hours a day. And I'm like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, that means it. And then I said, we're going to take out morning tea and lunch. So we're in the class for like 5 hours. And he's like, okay, so 5 hours a day. And there's 30 kids in the class. That means you've got 2 minutes for me every hour.
Oh.
An hour. He goes, that's 10 minutes a day. And he had a little timesheet.
No.
Serious. Turned out his timings weren't always right. He was actually creating a little every time. It might have been like a behaviour. But his point was right.
Absolutely.
I had 10 minutes of one-on-one time with him. He didn't have a teacher aide. And some days I didn't have 10 minutes because I had other students that needed me. So often as teachers, we write these IEPs that are just unrealistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, for him, actually, we would have been better off spending that 10 minutes a day in the playground and creating social connection, because if he came in anxious after play, actually I was spending a lot of time with him, talking him through social challenges that he had and trying to build his skills around that rather than learning. And this is the frustration. This is the frustration that parents and teachers face, and why I'm so thrilled that you've sort of highlighted some of the things we see every day. And, you sound like me, but very realistic that we do
absolutely.
have a lot of challenges and there's no easy answers, but just being aware of that and aware that there isn't a perfect system. I mean, we have to be really eclectic, and a lot of my listeners are in regional areas who don't even have a special school, so being aware of that. Is there anything else you want to share with us today?
I think just being mindful as well that a lot of kids, in regards to slipping under the radar, just because a child with autism is quiet in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going okay. And I think, like you said, teachers have 30 kids in the classroom. If a child's not misbehaving and a child's doing what they should do, then great, let them be. But a lot of the time it's when those kids get home that they're just having a full-blown meltdown. And I think a lot of the time when parents then approach the schools and say things like, oh, something's happening at school because when he gets home, this is what we're seeing. The school can, often think, well, oh no, that must be happening at home because he's fine here. Whereas it's actually like an accumulation of things that have happened throughout the school day that are contributing to the meltdown at home. And this is all before, you've even attempted homework, attempted bath and dinner and all of that. So I think one of the main things I am so passionate about is, like I said before, it should never, in the world of autism, in the world of any child, but especially with autism, it should just never be like us versus them. It should just always be like, let's all come together and let's, collaborate and figure out what's going on and how can we all contribute to this child's emotional well-being and mental health.
Absolutely. And that veneer of coping that many of my students do, and particularly that group we're talking about, the level 1, those kids who have enough masking skills to get through the day, and then the straw that breaks the camel's back, and my girls. And we have to realise if they're going home doing that, and some people do that at work. They smile at their boss all day and then go home and cry. So it's no different. And we have to remember we all do that. And it is that student, we need to unravel it and work out what it is. Now, again, some teachers will be saying, so I don't have the time.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's not, it's very quick. Like, I mean, I had one little boy, it was working out that the phys ed teacher let children do that, selecting the teams.
Yeah.
And he was always last to be chosen.
Yeah.
So he had meltdowns on those days when he got home because of the anxiety. And the phys ed teacher was amazing. I went to him, explained what was happening, and he actually would put up on his window on a whiteboard in the morning who the groups were going to be for phys ed that day.
Oh, so much better.
So much better. So my little boy knew there wasn't going to be that captain's pick.
Yeah.
He knew what group he was in. And it was, but can you imagine the anxiety that built up all day for him?
For sure,
and
the poor
standing,
thing.
we all remember that standing, waiting for you.
I know, so uncomfortable.
There's no educational outcome in that.
Yeah,
Prove
literally.
who's popular. Well,
Yeah.
great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that isn't a life goal,
Yeah.
so absolutely, absolutely. Oh my goodness, we have covered so much. I definitely want to get you back on to talk about siblings at some stage.
Sounds
And I
great.
will put in the notes your research and let people know how to connect with you beyond today, because I know you're a wealth of information and people can go to your website and learn more. And I just want to thank you for sharing and just helping us understand some confusions and misunderstandings. And if people have any questions, I'll get them to send them in, and maybe we'll do a follow up, because I
Yeah,
just think
sounds
we've
great.
covered so much on this confusion. So thank you so much for your time.
No worries.
Really, really
Thanks so
appreciate
much
it.
for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I hope you've got some great tips and strategies from this podcast. If you enjoy learning with me, I highly recommend you think about doing a course this year. Not only do I have courses by me, I have them with people with a lived experience, Temple Grandin, Dean Beadle, or other educators like Laura Kirby, PDA. I have a wealth of courses that'll make a difference to you. So make sure you check out all my online courses, because you can learn online, anywhere, anytime, in a place that suits you, at a speed that suits you. So check out all the online courses that are available to make a difference to you and the children you know.